Audio review of textbook in history for Class 12. Themes in Indian History, Part 2. Theme 5. Through the Eyes of Travelers. Perceptions of Societies. 10th to 17th Century.
Welcome to the Deep Dive. Today you're joining us as we explore perceptions of Indian society between the 10th and 17th centuries.
And we're doing this through the eyes of three really distinct travelers. Al-Biruni from, modern-day Uzbekistan, Ibn Battuta from Morocco, and François Bernier from France.
Exactly. We're going to unpack their backgrounds, why they even traveled to the subcontinent, what they noticed, and what struck them as, unusual or remarkable.
Our goal, really, is to get a unique window into this historical period through these outside views, trying to understand not just what they saw, but, how they interpreted it, too.
It's fascinating how different they were. Let's start with Al-Biruni in the 11th century. He wasn't just passing through, was he?
No, not at all. He came from Khwarizm, a huge center of learning. He knew Syriac, Arabic, Persian, Hebrew, and Sanskrit, even Greek philosophy via translations.
Wow. And he ended up in Ghazni, kind of as a hostage initially, right? But then developed this real interest in India.
Yeah, Sultan Mahmud brought him there. But it sparked something. He spent years, literally years, with Brahmana priests and scholars, mostly in Punjab and northern India, learning Sanskrit, studying texts.
Which led to his major work, the Kitab-ul-Hind, written in Arabic.
That's the one. It's massive, like 80 chapters covering everything: religion, philosophy, festivals, astronomy, alchemy, social life, you name it.
And his structure was quite academic, wasn't it?
Very methodical. Each chapter starts with a question, then he describes the Indian perspective based on Sanskritic traditions, and then he compares it with other cultures he knew.
So who's he writing this for?
Primarily for people living along the frontiers of the subcontinent, maybe to help them discuss religious ideas with Hindus, or just as a source of information. He was trying to bridge a gap.
He even did translations both ways, didn't he? Like Patanjali into Arabic and Euclid into Sanskrit.
He did, for his Brahmana friends, which shows a real intellectual exchange. But he also pointed out barriers to understanding.
Like what?
Well, language, obviously. He found Sanskrit incredibly vast. And then differences in religion and customs, and what he perceived as a certain insularity among the locals.
And he relied heavily on texts, Vedas, Puranas, Manusmrtiya.
Yes, very much a text-based understanding of society. He looked at the Varna system, the four main social categories, and compared it to social structures in ancient Persia.
But he had issues with the concept of pollution, right?
Yeah, he disapproved of it, called it contrary to the laws of nature. It's an interesting early example of comparative sociology, but also shows his own cultural lens.
Okay, let's jump forward a few centuries to the 14th and Ibn Battuta, a very different character.
Totally different. Born in Tangier, Morocco, from a family known for Islamic law expertise. For him, travel was the source of knowledge, experience over texts, you could say.
And he'd traveled extensively before even reaching India in 1333. Mecca, Syria, Persia, East Africa.
Oh yeah, he'd seen a lot. He reached Sind, then was drawn to Delhi because Sultan Muhammad bin Tughlaq had this reputation as a patron of arts and learning.
And the Sultan appointed him quasi a judge.
He did, for several years. Though they had a falling out later, he was eventually restored and then sent as an envoy to China in 1342.
Which turned into another massive journey through central India, the Malabar Coast, Maldives.
Right, he was quasi in the Maldives too for 18 months. Then Sri Lanka, Bengal, Assam, Sumatra, eventually China, and finally back to Morocco in 1347. What a life.
His travelogue, the Rila, it's more about the experience, right? Less academic than Al-Biruni.
Much more. It was dictated after his return, meant to entertain and amaze. It's full of rich details about social and cultural life. He describes things that were clearly exotic to him.
Like the coconut.
Yes, famously comparing it to a man's head.
Yeah.
And palatan, the betel leaf preparation. He details how it's made and chewed, things completely outside his Moroccan experience.
What about the cities? What was his impression?
He found Indian cities like Delhi and Daulatabad incredibly densely populated and prosperous. Crowded streets, vibrant markets. He describes Delhi's huge walls and gates.
And the markets weren't just for trade.
No, he saw them as economic, social, and cultural centers, sometimes with mosques and temples right there, spaces for public performances. He even mentions a specific market in Dalbad, Tarbabad, just for singers, with decorated shops.
He also noted the agriculture was very productive.
2 crops a year, which impressed him, and India's deep integration into trade networks across Asia textiles were in huge demand.
What else stood out?
The postal system. He was amazed by its efficiency, both the horse post, the uluk, and the foot post, the dawa.
And he talks about slaves, too.
Yes, their purchase and gifting. He notes differences among them, some female slaves skilled in music and dance, others used as spies by nobles. And of course, for domestic labor, like carrying palanquins, it gives a glimpse into that aspect of society.
Okay, fast forward again. 17th century. François Bernier arrives, a Frenchman.
Right, a physician, political philosopher, historian. He came to the Mogul Empire seeking opportunities around 1656.
He got quite close to the court.
Very close. He was physician to Prince Darhashuko and later associated with Danishman Khan, an important noble. He traveled quite a bit within the country.
His approach seems different again, more comparative, but with a specific benchmark.
Definitely. He constantly compared India with Europe, especially France, and often India came off worse in his descriptions.
He wrote for a European audience.
Yes, his main work was dedicated to King Louis XIV, and he wrote letters to influential officials. His writings became very popular back in Europe, quickly translated. They presented a certain image of India.
Often a bleak one, you said?
Generally, yes, though it wasn't always accurate. He was a firm believer in private property. He saw the Mogul system, where the crown theoretically owned all land, as disastrous.
Disastrous.
He argued it led to the oppression of the peasantry, ruined agriculture, and lowered living standards because there was no incentive for long-term investment by the landholders who could be removed.
So he describes the peasants as really suffering.
Terribly impoverished, subject to tyranny, he claimed. He even mentions people being forced to sell their children. He saw society as starkly divided: tiny rich elite, vast poor masses, and crucially, in his view, no middle state.
And this fed into European ideas.
Absolutely. His work was very influential in shaping the concept of Oriental despotism, this idea of stagnant, arbitrarily ruled Eastern societies.
But did he acknowledge anything positive?
Well, yes. He couldn't ignore the fertility of places like Bengal or the production of valuable goods, silks, cotton, indigo. He noted the huge inflow of gold and silver into India via trade. He recognized a prosperous merchant community existed.
What about artisans? He mentioned the karkhanas, the imperial workshops.
He described them, yes, artisans producing goods for the court. But his tone often implied a kind of stagnation, a lack of progress compared to Europe. He also saw Mughal cities largely as camp towns, dependent on the court's presence.
And he focused on specific customs, too, like sati.
Yes, the practice of widow immolation. He gave detailed, often harrowing accounts of instances he claimed to witness, distinguishing between apparently willing and forced cases, like a tragic story of a young widow in Lahore. He also mentions nobles using female slaves as spies, similar to Ibn Battuta.
So 3 very different travelers, 3 very different perspectives across centuries.
Exactly. Al-Biruni, the scholar trying to understand through texts and comparison. Ibn Battuta, the adventurer captivated by the novel and vibrant reality. And Bernier, the European philosopher, often judging India against a preconceived model.
Their accounts, with all their biases, give us these invaluable, if sometimes conflicting, snapshots.
It really highlights how the observer's background shapes what they see and how they report it.
Which brings us to a final thought for everyone listening. In our hyper-connected world today, how might a modern traveler approach and document experiences in a completely unfamiliar society?
Yeah, what things might still seem truly unusual or remarkable, and how would their interpretations, filtered through today's global awareness and perhaps different cultural sensitivities, compare to those of Al-Biruni, Ibn Battuta, or Bernier? Something to ponder.
Theme 6. Bhakti and Sufi traditions. Changes in religious beliefs and devotional texts. 8th to 18th century.
All right, diving in today, getting into a really transformative time and place. The Indian subcontinent, we're talking like 8th to 18th centuries. Going to be fascinating. You've given me some really incredible stuff to work with here. Historical texts, images.
Oh, yeah.
We're going to untangle these stories of Bakti and Sufi traditions.
Yeah.
We're looking for those big shifts in belief, how people express their devotion. All in this super dynamic period. It's going to uncover some interesting connections along the way, I think.
Oh, absolutely. It's such an exciting period because you can really see how fluid these traditions were. Like, we've got this poetry, beautiful poetry from these poet saints writing in their local languages, and then these stories about their lives, hagiographies they're called, give us a glimpse into how people saw them, their followers, and of course the Puranas, these ancient texts, but they're evolving too, right?
Right.
I mean, it's a good reminder that these weren't just static traditions. Everything's being reinterpreted, added to, built upon over time. I mean, even that bronze sculpture of Manakaba Chakar, I think it's figure 6.1,
Hmm.
early example. But you see that deep personal devotion that marks the whole region.
Yeah, it's striking. And one of the things that really jumps out, at least from the materials you gave me, is this rise of all these gods and goddesses.
Yeah.
Vishnu, Shiva, Devi, front and center. What drove that?
Well, you see this really interesting back and forth happening.
Okay.
You've got the Brahmanical ideas, the ones from the Puranas. They start spreading more widely, reaching more people. And at the same time, you have this adoption of local beliefs and local gods brought right into that Brahmanical fold. Like, take Jagannatha in Puri, figure 6.2.
Okay.
Local deity, tribal god, becomes a form of Vishnu. It's fascinating.
No.
Scholars call this interplay between these big, like, pan-Indian traditions and these little, more local ones, each influencing the other.
Right.
You see it with the goddess cults, with tantric practices, too. Really interesting. They were known for being open, often didn't care about those traditional caste hierarchies.
So the religious landscape is just like completely reshaping itself. Older Vedic gods, Agni, Indra, they're not as central anymore.
Yeah, exactly. The Vedas were still respected, absolutely.
Okay.
But those Puranic gods, their stories were so rich and you could connect with them on a personal level. That really took off. It wasn't always peaceful, though, this transition.
Right.
The sources show tension, not just between these changing traditions, but also with Buddhism and Jainism, which were already there.
Interesting. Okay, so that sets the stage for Bhakti, right?
Yeah.
In Tamil Nadu, you've got the Alvars and Nainars coming on the scene like 6th century,
Yeah.
devotees of Vishnu and Shiva, and they were known for wandering, for singing in Tamil.
Totally. Traveling, singing those Tamil hymns, really impactful. By singing about these places, they made them sacred. And that led to temples being built, pilgrimage routes.
So they're literally shaping the landscape.
Exactly. And then their songs become part of the rituals in those temples.
Wow.
And eventually, even their images start being worshipped. It's incredible.
That's amazing. And their attitude towards caste was pretty striking too, right? You've got people from all walks of life in these Bhakti movements. Seems like a real challenge to the status quo.
Oh, yeah, absolutely a key element. You've got brahmanas and people completely outside the caste system all coming together. That suggests some reformist ideas within these movements, for sure. And the way the Nalera Divya Prabandham is revered, almost like a Tamil Veda, underscores their importance. And then you have these powerful women devotees, too.
Right.
Like Undal. Her love for Vishnu, legendary. And then Karkalamaier, figure 6.4, I think it's source 3. She embraced a life of extreme asceticism. These women were navigating, even pushing back against those patriarchal norms.
Really fascinating figures. And their relationship with the ruling powers is interesting too. At first, it seems like there was some competition with Buddhism and Jainism, maybe for royal patronage. But then you get the Chola rulers, 9th to 13th centuries? They're actively supporting Brahmanical and Bhakti traditions, land grants, building these amazing temples to Dambaram, Thanjavur, and those incredible sculptures like the Shiva Nataraja.
Oh, yeah, figure 6.5, that one. Those Chola kings knew what they were doing, aligning themselves with these popular movements. Smart move politically and socially.
Right.
Honoring these revered Nainars and Alvars, having those Tamil Shaiva hymns, the Taram, sung in the temples, even consecrating metal images of those saints. It's all about connecting with getting support from powerful groups like the Vela peasants.
So it's like this whirlwind of religious activity between the 8th and 18th centuries, right? Traditions blending, clashing, transforming. And these poet saints, their devotion is so personal, so powerful. It really gives you a look into how people were trying to connect with the divine.
Absolutely. And it makes you wonder, how does this period, this explosion of religious dynamism, how does it resonate with what we see happening today?
Yeah.
All these religious traditions interouting, changing. It's an age-old question, isn't it? The search for understanding, for belonging, really makes you think.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
It does.
Theme 7. An imperial capital, Viganagara. 14th to 16th century.
Imagine uncovering a lost metropolis, Viganagara, the city of victory. It vanished after 1565, but its story Well, it lives on through the ruins at Hempe and the sources you shared.
It really does. It's like piecing together a giant historical jigsaw puzzle.
So our mission today is to really dig into those sources, uncover the key insights about, its rediscovery, the power structures, how the city was laid out, and this fascinating interplay between sacred and royal authority.
Exactly. We've got quite a mix of material. There's Colonel Colin Mackenzie's first survey work back in 1800. He was relying a lot on the memories of priests at the Virupaksha temple.
Right, oral history, essentially.
Yeah, initially. But then later, photography comes in around 1856, and epigraphy, that's studying inscriptions from 1836 onwards.
Yeah.
They really help document the site visually and textually.
And we're layering that with accounts from foreign travelers, people like Pays and Abdurazak.
Nicole de Conti, Barbosa, Fernão Nunes, too, a whole range of perspectives, plus local literature in Telugu, Kannada, Tamil, Sanskrit. It's quite comprehensive.
It's fascinating how Mackenzie, working for the East India Company, saw understanding India's past as, well, important for actually governing.
Yes, that was definitely part of the motivation, understanding the local history and structures to better administer the territory.
Okay, so let's talk about who was actually in charge. The rulers, the Rayas.
Well, the empire itself was founded way back in 1336 by two brothers, Harihara and Buka. But it wasn't a static thing. Its frontiers were always shifting, and it encompassed, a really diverse mix of people.
And they were constantly competing with neighbors, right? The Deccan Sultans, the Gajapati rulers of Orissa.
Absolutely. Competing for fertile river valleys, crucial resources, and importantly, control over profitable trade routes. This competition, though, also led to borrowing ideas.
Ah, interesting. Especially in architecture.
Yes, exactly. They weren't shy about adopting and adapting architectural styles from neighboring states. You see a blend of influences. Contemporaries actually called the empire Karnataka Samrayamu.
And militarily, what gave them an edge?
Cavalry was key, so the horse trade was incredibly important. First with Arab traders, local merchants called Kudirai Chetties, and then later the Portuguese became major players, especially as they brought superior military technology like firearms.
And all this underpinned by trade wealth.
Definitely. Spices, textiles, precious stones. Viganagara was a major hub, and that prosperity fueled its power and, well, its impressive building projects.
Let's track the dynasties. Sangama Saluva, then the Tuluva dynasty, which brings us to Krishnadeva Raya. He seems like a pivotal figure.
Oh, absolutely. His reign, 1509 to 1529, is often seen as the empire's peak. Huge expansion consolidating control over the Raichur Doab, pushing back Orissa. It was a time of relative peace and prosperity internally.
And he wasn't just a warrior king. He was a builder and a scholar, too.
Very much so. Lots of temple building, adding grand gopurams, founding a whole new suburban township called Nagalapuram after his mother. And he even wrote a work on statecraft, the Amukta in Telugu.
What did that book emphasize?
It really stressed the importance of encouraging trade horses, elephants, gems, and taking care of foreign sailors and merchants. He understood the connection between trade and state power.
But things went downhill after him.
Well, yes, succession struggles began, and those military chiefs, the Nayakas, became more rebellious, seeking more autonomy. By 1542, power effectively shifted to a new dynasty, the Aravidu.
And the relationship with the Deccan Sultanates. It wasn't always hostile.
No, it was complex. There were alliances, interventions. Krishnadeva Raya himself was sometimes called the establisher of the Yavana kingdom, meaning he'd intervened to support one sultanate claimant. But later, Ramaraya's policy of trying to play the sultanates off against each other backfired spectacularly.
Leading to the Battle of Rashasi Tangadi, or Telakota, in 1565.
Exactly. The sultanates finally united against Viganagara, defeated Ramaraya's forces, and sacked the capital city. It was devastating. The center of power then shifted further south to places like Penukonda and Chandragiri.
Let's unpack these Nayakas a bit more. Who were they?
They were essentially military chiefs. They controlled forts, commanded armed supporters, often Telugu-speaking migrants, and were frequently accompanied by peasants looking for new agricultural lands to settle.
And the Amara Nayaka system. How did that work?
It was the system the Rayas used to govern. They granted territories to these military commanders, the Amara Nayakas. In return, the Nayakas collected taxes, maintained a specified contingent of troops and horses for the king, sent tribute, and made personal allowances at court.
Sounds a bit like feudal systems elsewhere.
There are parallels. Some scholars suggest it might derive inspiration from the Delhi Sultanate's Ikata system. But a key point is that these Nayakas gradually became very powerful in their own right, establishing independent kingdoms, which ultimately weakened the central authority and contributed to the empire's collapse.
Okay, shifting gears to the city itself. Its location seems strategic.
Definitely. Nestled in this natural basin formed by the Tungabhadra River, surrounded by these imposing granite hills that offered natural defenses.
And they harnessed the water, didn't they?
Oh, incredibly sophisticated water management. They built embankments along streams to create reservoirs of various sizes. The Kamalapuram tank is a great example, and canals, like the Hiria Canal, drew water from the river and tanks, channeling it to irrigate fields and supply the city.
Pais described Krishnadevaraya building a huge tank.
Yes, a really vivid account mentioning how they had to break down a hill, the labor involved, bringing water through pipes from a lake. It shows the scale of their engineering projects.
And the fortifications, they sound immense.
They were. Abdurazak, that ambassador from Persia, described 7 lines of forts. What's crucial is that these walls didn't just enclose the urban core, they encompassed agricultural land and forests, too.
Why include farmland?
It was a brilliant strategy for siege warfare. By having cultivated fields within the fortifications, the city could potentially withstand a long siege without starving. Very practical.
How are they built?
The construction itself is impressive. They used large wedge-shaped blocks of stone, fitted together often without any mortar. Roads generally followed the valleys between the hills, winding around, with major roads extending out from temple gateways, usually lined with bazaars.
What about where ordinary people lived?
That's harder to see archaeologically. We don't have much evidence for ordinary houses. Barbosa described them as thatched but well-built, often arranged in long streets based on occupation. We do find clues, though.
Like?
Well, finds of Chinese porcelain suggest there were wealthy traders. There's also evidence of a distinct Muslim residential quarter with its own tombs and mosques. Interestingly, the architecture there shows influences similar to the mandapas found in the temples, a sort of Indo-Islamic blend.
So signs of diversity within the city walls.
Absolutely. And numerous shrines and smaller temples suggest a variety of cults and practices existed beyond the major state-sponsored temples. Water for common folk probably came from wells, rainwater tanks, and maybe temple tanks.
Let's move to the Royal Center, southwest part of the site.
That's right. It's distinct from the Sacred Center. This area contained over 60 temples, but also, crucially, about 30 palace complexes, though the palaces themselves, well, the superstructures were made of perishable material, so mostly only the platforms remain.
Temples, even in the Royal Center.
Yes. Patronage of temples was key for rulers everywhere in India to establish and legitimize their authority, linking themselves to divinity.
What are some key structures there? The Mahanavami Diba.
That's a big one. A massive platform, probably the audience hall, described by Pays. It's associated with the Mahanavami festival, a 10-day Hindu festival. Rituals performed there likely included worship of the image, the state horse, sacrifices, dances, processions, and receiving tribute from the Nayakas, though some question if the space was actually big enough for the grand processions described.
And the Lotus Mahal. Sounds pretty.
It does. The name was given by British travelers in the 19th century. It's a beautiful structure with distinctive lobed arches, showing that Indo-Islamic influence again. Its actual function is debated, maybe a council chamber where the king met advisors.
Near it are the elephant stables.
Another structure named by the British. It has these elaborate arched frontages and domed chambers. Whether it actually housed elephants is uncertain, but it's impressive regardless.
And the Hazararama Temple.
That one's interesting. Located right in the heart of the royal center, it was probably used only by the king and his family. The inner walls have these incredibly detailed, sculpted panels depicting scenes from the Ramayana.
It seems this palatial architecture influenced later rulers, too.
Definitely. The Nayakas, who established kingdoms after Vijanagara's decline, continued some of these building traditions. You see echoes of Vijanagara style, for example, in the audience hall at Madurai.
Okay, now the Sacred Center, the northern part along the river.
Yes, on the rocky northern end along the Tungabhadra. This area has deep mythological associations linked to local traditions in the Ramayana, like the monkey kingdom of Vali and Sugriva, and the local mother goddess Pampadevi, who married Virupaksha.
Virupaksha being the guardian deity.
Exactly, a form of Shiva and the patron deity of the Vijayanagara rulers. This area had religious significance long before the empire, with pre-Vijayanagara Jaina temples found there too. Temple building wasn't new to the region. Pallavas, Chalukyas, Hoysalas, Cholas, all built here.
So the Vijayanagara rulers tapped into an existing sacred landscape.
Precisely. Temples were more than just religious sites. They were social, cultural, economic hubs. Rulers patronized them to demonstrate piety, consolidate power, and win support. The Vijayanagara kings explicitly claimed to rule on behalf of Virupaksha. Their royal orders were often signed Sri Virupaksha.
And they used the title Hindu Suratrana.
Yes, literally meaning Hindu sultan, a Sanskritization of the Arabic term sultan. It shows them positioning themselves in relation to the sultanates, asserting their authority in a shared political vocabulary, but emphasizing their Hindu identity. Royal visits to temples were major state occasions, sometimes marked by installing portrait sculptures of themselves.
What about the temple architecture itself? What's distinctive?
The Raya Gopurams, those massive, ornate royal gateway towers, are a hallmark. They often dwarf the actual shrine towers, marking the king's presence. Also, large mandapas, or pavilions, and long pillared corridors within temple complexes.
The Virupaksha temple is central, right?
It is. It developed over centuries. The earliest shrine dates back maybe to the 9th or 10th century. The Vijayanagara rulers significantly enlarged it. Krishnadevaraya, for instance, built the main hall in front of the shrine and decorated the eastern Gopuram. These halls served many purposes: music, dance, celebrating deity marriages, housing images on swings.
And the Vithala temple.
Another major complex. The principal deity is Vithala, a form of Vishnu generally worshipped in Maharashtra, suggesting cultural exchange. It's famous for its unique shrine designed as a chariot, and the halls with intricately carved musical pillars.
And these temples had streets leading from them.
Yes, chariot streets extended from the temple Gopurams in a straight line. These were paved and lined with pillared pavilions that likely functioned as shops or market stalls. Pui's gave a really vivid description of the bizarre street in front of his house.
Ah, yes. Tell us about that.
He described it as broad, with merchants selling everything: rubies, diamonds, emeralds, pearls, fine cloths, everyday goods. In the evenings, a fair with horses for sale, fruits, vegetables, wood, just bustling activity. Nunes also mentions markets overflowing with cheap and abundant produce and meats, though he includes some rather unusual items like rats and cats being sold, which gives you a sense of the sheer variety, maybe desperation for some.
It sounds like mapping this huge site must have been a monumental task.
Absolutely. Since the early 1980s, there's been intensive mapping, dividing the site into squares, then subdivisions, carefully documenting every feature: walls, structures, roads, bazaars. Thousands have been recovered. But it's crucial, as you mentioned, to remember the vanished elements, the wooden columns, brackets, upper floors that travelers described but haven't survived. We have to imagine those back into the picture.
So looking back at all this, what do the buildings really tell us?
Well, they reveal so much about organization, construction techniques, defensive strategies, cultural influences, and the ideas the rulers wanted to project: power, piety, legitimacy. But interpreting the symbols within them requires cross-referencing with literature, inscriptions, and living traditions.
Like comparing Krishnadevaraya's statue at Chidambaram, how he wanted to be seen, versus Pei's physical description of him.
Exactly, multiple perspectives. But what we often lack is insight into the thoughts and experiences of ordinary people. How did they access these royal and sacred spaces? What did they think of these colossal building projects? Who were the builders? Where did they come from? How were they paid? How were materials transported? So many questions remain unanswered.
Vijayanagara, then, through all these layers of sources, emerges as this incredibly complex, powerful empire, built on strategic thinking, trade, innovative governance, and this really fascinating blend of traditions.
It's a remarkable glimpse into a sophisticated urban civilization. The detailed accounts and the archaeology give us so much, but they also highlight just how much we still don't know, especially about the everyday lives.
It makes you think, doesn't it? The sheer scale, the rise, the fall. What does it tell us about empires in general? And about how memory and material remains keep these stories alive, even centuries later. You wonder what other lost cities might hold similar, untold stories waiting to be pieced together.
Theme 8. Peasants, Zamindars, and the State. Agrarian Society and the Mogul Empire. 16th, 17th centuries.
All right, welcome back to the deep dive. Today, we're going to be looking at something pretty fundamental. Agrarian society in the Mogul Empire. Kind of 16th, 17th century-ish, right? I mean, when you think about it, 85% of the population or something like that, I mean, a huge amount of the people, they lived in villages.
Yeah, absolutely.
All tied to the land. So we're really trying to understand how this world worked. Who had power, who didn't, what were the relationships like?
And it's, you think about agriculture, you kind of think, oh, farmers in the land. But it was so much more dynamic, so much more going on. You have these peasants, you have the elites who own the land, and they're cooperating sometimes, they're competing, sometimes they're in open conflict with each other. Really fascinating stuff.
Yeah, and then, of course, you've got the big guy, the mogul state,
Yeah.
sitting on top of all of it.
Right.
And their whole goal, their entire sort of financial system, is extracting as much as they can from the land.
Exactly.
And that shapes the policies, shapes what people grow, how they grow it. So we really want to get into all that. And of course, you can't forget about the revenue agents, the guys actually, doing the dirty work of the state.
Absolutely, yeah. And connecting these villages to the wider world, too. We tend to think about agrarian societies as being really isolated, but with the growth of trade and, money, markets, all that,
Right.
these crops are actually feeding into the growth of towns and cities, too.
All right, so let's get down to the nitty-gritty here. Let's talk about peasant life, what it was actually like to be a farmer in this period. So the village is the basic unit, right? You're living in this village, your life is dictated by the seasons, but it's not just these nice, neat farms we imagine, is it?
No, it's much more diverse than that. You have these settled areas, but you've also got dry lands, hilly regions, forests, all these different types of landscapes shaping what people are doing.
And it's fascinating when you look at the sources we have, right? We have this grand, almost like a textbook, the Anak Bari, that's giving us the Mughal perspective from the top down.
Right.
Then we have these regional revenue records that give us a much more, I guess you could say, ground level view.
Exactly, yeah. The Ain is great, but it's one perspective. And when we bring in these other sources, we get to see these conflicts. We get to see how the peasants themselves saw things. Even the East India Company records give us another angle.
Even the language itself is really interesting, right? All these different terms for peasant, rayat, muzarian, kisan. It really shows you that even within the peasantry itself, there's this kind of hierarchy, right?
Absolutely. Yeah, and the distinction between the Kud Kashta, the resident cultivators, and the Pahi Kashta, the non-resident ones who are moving around, it's not a monolithic group at all.
Why would someone be Pahi Kashta, though? What would make them leave their home village?
Sometimes it was looking for better deals, better revenue terms with a different landlord.
Oh, interesting.
Sometimes it was just hardship, things weren't going well in their village, so they had to move on. Shows you the kind of economic pressures people were facing.
So what did most peasants actually have, in terms of possessions, tools, that kind of thing?
Not a lot, right? We're talking bare minimum, a couple of bullocks if you're lucky, maybe a plow or two. They didn't have a lot of stuff.
And they did own their land, right?
Yeah. Yeah, individually you could buy and sell land, and there was a lot of expansion going on because there was so much land available, so much labor available, so that really drove things forward.
And when we think about crops, the staples are obvious, right? Rice, wheat, millets.
Right, exactly.
But it all depends on the monsoons, doesn't it?
Oh,
If
absolutely.
the rain doesn't come.
Yeah, it's all over. But the Mughals did a lot with irrigation, building canals, and then you've got the more traditional stuff like the Persian wheel.
Right.
All these ways to try and get water to the crops.
And the technology itself wasn't super advanced, right?
No, pretty simple stuff, wooden plows, mostly. Broadcasting seeds. Nothing super fancy.
But the agricultural year itself was actually quite sophisticated. 2 main seasons, the Kharif and the Rabi. That often allowed for double cropping, the Dufasla.
Yeah, and the variety was incredible. You look at the records, and they're growing everything from Agra down to Bengal, so many different crops.
And then there's this concept of Jinzi Camille, these perfect crops
Right.
that the state is pushing because they're good for revenue, right? Things like cotton, sugarcane. It's
Yeah.
interesting how it's not just about subsistence farming.
No, it blurs the lines, right? You're growing to feed yourself, but you're also growing to sell, to pay taxes, and you even start to see some new crops coming in from the Americas,
Oh, right.
like maize, tomatoes. This is all happening in the 17th century.
Wow, so we've got this picture of the village, the individual peasant. But what about the community itself? How did that all work? We know about individual land ownership, but there's this collective element too, right?
Yeah, you have the cultivators themselves, obviously, but then you have this panchayat, which is like a council of elders.
Okay.
And then you've got the headman, the muqaddam or mandal, who's kind of the leader of the village. But, it's not all rosy. We have to talk about caste. This is where you see these really deep inequalities. You've got the landless laborers, the major, who are struggling, facing a lot of poverty.
And this is tied directly to the caste system.
Absolutely. And it's not just Hindus. Even within Muslim communities, you see these caste distinctions.
So there's no moving up the social ladder.
Well, there's a little bit of fluidity, actually. Some groups, like the Rajputs or the Jats, they start gaining status. But by and large, it's pretty rigid.
And the panchayats, these village councils, what kind of power did they have?
Oh, a lot, actually. They could make decisions, settle disputes. Their decisions were binding on everyone in the village. They managed all sorts of affairs, collected funds, dealt with emergencies. The headman would oversee the accounts, make sure everything's running smoothly. They even upheld caste boundaries, they could levy fines, even excommunicate people.
That's a lot of power. And the state just let them do all of this.
Well, when it came to civil disputes, the state mostly respected the panchayats' decisions, especially the jati panchayats, which were the caste-based councils. And peasants could actually petition the panchayats if they felt they were being treated unfairly, like if taxes were too high or they were being forced to do unpaid labor.
It's not just farmers and elites, though, right? There's all these other folks who are crucial to how the village works, right? All the artisans.
Oh, yeah, a huge part of the community. Potters, blacksmiths, carpenters, all the essential stuff.
Right, right.
Some estimates say they made up maybe 25% of the village households.
Wow, that's a lot. And how were they compensated for their work?
It really varied. Sometimes it was through harvest shares, so they would get a portion of the crops. Sometimes they were granted land. Sometimes it was just, bartering, exchanging goods and services. It shows you how interconnected everyone was.
Yeah, and I guess this idea that villages were these kind of egalitarian little republics just doesn't quite hold up, does it?
No, not really. You've got individual ownership, you've got caste, you've got all these inequalities built in. Plus, there's already this cash nexus developing, trade, revenue collection.
So where do women fit into all of this? What were their roles?
They were involved in everything, really, working in the fields alongside men, sowing, weeding, threshing. Of course, certain tasks were considered, men's work and women's work, but their labor was absolutely essential.
Right.
And their household labor, that's the basis of the whole system, really. And they were also involved in crafts, spinning, making pottery, all sorts of things. As things became more commercialized, the demand for women's labor just went up.
And in a society that's so dependent on labor, their role as child bearers, that must have been seen as incredibly important, right?
Oh, absolutely. And it's reflected in customs like bride price, where the groom's family would pay the bride's family. It shows you how much value is placed on women's ability to have children. And remarriage was totally legitimate in a lot of communities. It wasn't this taboo thing.
But did that mean they had power,
Yeah.
Or were they just, under the control of their husbands and fathers?
Well, it's a complex picture. You definitely have patriarchal control. The household is headed by a male. Women are punished for, suspected infidelity. But we also have evidence of women petitioning the panchayats for redress. If their husband's being unfaithful, if he's neglecting her, she can go to the panchayat and ask for help. Of course, a lot of these records, it's still through their male relatives, but they are taking action.
Right.
And amongst the landed gentry, women do have inheritance rights. They can buy and sell land, and some of them become pretty powerful zamindars in their own right.
Wow. So we've talked about villages, but the Mughal Empire was vast. It wasn't just villages, right? You have these huge forest areas, too.
Absolutely. And these forests are home to communities that live very differently, right? They're gathering, hunting, practicing shifting cultivation. They're much more mobile.
Right.
And the state often sees these forests as it's a whole other world out there. And, you can't forget about cultural influences. Like Sufi saints play a big role in spreading Islam into these newly colonized areas.
And then there's the zamindars themselves, right? These landed elites that we've mentioned a few times. Who were they exactly?
Basically, they were the big guys in the countryside, right? They had land, they had social status, often linked to their caste. They had these big estates, milkiyat, that they could cultivate themselves or rent out to others.
Okay.
But their real power came from the fact that they collected taxes for the Mughal state.
So the state outsourced that to them.
Exactly. And they got a cut of the revenue, of course. Plus, they often had their own little armies, their own fortresses. So they were a force to be reckoned with.
I guess that explains why they had such a complex relationship with the peasantry, right?
Yeah, definitely. They could exploit peasants, extract high rents, force them to do labor. But there was also this element of reciprocity. paternalism. They would provide protection, sometimes even loans.
Right.
It's interesting, even the Bhakti saints, who were very critical of social hierarchies, they don't really condemn the zamindars outright. And when there were uprisings against the state, peasants often sided with the zamindars, not the revenue officials.
So it's not just black and white, good guy, bad guy.
No, much more nuanced than that.
So let's finally talk about the land revenue system itself.
Mm-hmm.
This is the heart of the Mughal economy, right?
Absolutely. I mean, this is how they funded their whole empire.
So how did it work?
Basically, you have this whole administrative apparatus centered around the Diwan's office, which is responsible for assessing how much revenue each area should pay, collected it, making sure everything's running smoothly.
Okay.
And it's a two-step process, right? First, you have the assessment, the jama, where they figure out how much each area owes. Then you have the actual collection, the hazel.
And did everyone pay in cash?
Akbar really pushed for cash payment, but in practice, a lot of people still paid in kind, with grain or other crops. And the state was always trying to get as much as they could, but they also had to be realistic. If they pushed too hard, people would just abandon their land.
Right, that makes sense.
And they went to great length to measure the land, classify it, figure out how much each piece of land could potentially produce. Akbar even had this whole classification system, palaj, which was land that was cultivated every year. Then you had parati, which was fallow land left to recover. And then you had chatshar, which was land that was left fallow for 3 or 4 years. And then banjar, which was uncultivated for 5 years or more.
Wow, they really thought about this.
Oh, yeah, they had a whole system. And then within the first 2 categories, you had these quality classes based on how fertile the land was. And the revenue was usually set at 1/3 of the average produce. And then when it came to collecting in kind, they had all these different methods. Kankut, which was basically an estimate. Then you had batai or bauli, which was crop sharing after the harvest. And then there was ket batai, which was dividing the field after sowing. And then long batai, which was dividing the heap of grain after it was cut.
So they were pretty flexible.
Yeah, they had to be. They had to adapt to local conditions. And then later on, under Aurangzeb, they really focused on detailed surveys, Majadat, Asamyawar, to make sure the assessment was as accurate as possible. He was trying to balance the government's needs with the welfare of the peasants.
And then there's this whole thing about silver,
Yeah.
right? Like the influx of silver from the Americas. How did that play into all of this?
Yeah, that's a big one. The Mughal Empire was one of the major powers in Asia, right? They had a lot of resources. And after the Europeans started sailing around the world, all this silver started flowing into Asia. And India was a major destination because they didn't have any natural silver mines.
Right.
And the silver, it really boosted the economy. It made the rupiah, the Mughal silver coin, really stable. So you had all this money circulating, which made it easier for the state to collect revenue in cash. I mean, there's this Italian traveler, Giovanni Carreri, he wrote about how all this silver was flowing into India, to pay for Indian goods. It just shows you how much money was changing hands, how much trade was going on.
Fascinating.
Okay.
So last but not least, we have to talk about the Ani-Akbari.
Mm-hmm.
This document is just incredible.
It really is. I mean, it's Abu Fazl's masterpiece. He was Akbar's, right-hand man.
Right.
And he spent years compiling this massive record of Akbar's administration. It's like a giant encyclopedia of the Mughal Empire. You've got details on everything, the court, the army, the provinces, even the cultural traditions.
That's a pretty important source for understanding this period.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, it's our main source for Akbar's reign. But we have to remember, it's written from the perspective of the Mughal court. It's a top-down view.
Right.
But it does give us this incredible insight into how the empire worked, down to the nitty-gritty details. Like, you can see how much revenue each province was paying, what the caste composition of the zamindars was, how many troops each region had. And Abu Fazl, he really tried to be accurate. He cross-checked his information, used multiple sources.
So it's not just propaganda.
No, not at all. It's a serious attempt to document the empire.
So after this deep dive, what's the takeaway? What have we learned about agrarian society in the Mughal Empire?
Well, I think it's clear that it was a complex world, right? You've got these intricate social hierarchies, the constant interplay between nature and human intervention, the state trying to extract as much as possible from the land. And then you start to see these commercial connections developing, the flow of silver, the growth of markets, it's all starting to come together.
It's important to remember that our sources, they all have their own perspectives.
Exactly.
Especially the Ain,
Yeah.
It's giving us a very particular view of the world. So here's something to think about. We've talked about the peasants, the zamindars, the state, all these different players. How do you think these relationships, these dynamics, shaped the long-term trajectory of the subcontinent? What continuities do we see? What changes have happened since then?
It's a big question.
Yeah, lots to unpack there. Thanks for joining us on the Deep Dive.
Thanks for having me.